right. Hello and welcome yet again to another session of the Fourth Generation Initiative. I'm joined by Comrade Manzi, usual suspects, and our source of insights and analysis on occurrences on the continent and around the world. Today we're addressing a very serious issue that emerged recently. We are still, of course, committed to the same task of evolving, conceptual tools of analysis, giving us the intellectual and philosophical tools that we can use to understand the politics of the African continent, because we are committed to the belief that one cannot transform fundamentally what one does not understand. So for us to be able to move our continent forward, we need to have a correct grasp of the challenges that confront us. We need to have a correct grasp of the nature of our societies in order to intervene well. So welcome yet again for another session. Today we'll be talking about the recent episodes of what you'd call xenophobia, or what has been termed xenophobia in popular circles in South Africa. And to just give us a backdrop of that, um, recently, and that was around the 29th of April, the March and March movement, which we'll talk about in a second, organized a series of protests, you can call them demonstrations, around two cities in South Africa, in Tshwane and in Johannesburg. And it drew, on average, 300 to 500 people that were marching, and the sentiment was around anti-illegal immigration, but particularly of a very particular kind, and that was targeted against illegal immigrants from African countries, from other African countries. And as usual, there were all these derogatory slurs that were going around, in expression of, and obviously attributions of most of the social ills that society has as a country, that South Africa has as a country, towards these so-called aliens and illegal immigrants. Of course, there is the data that some two people, at least the Nigerian consulate, I think, confirmed that two Nigerians were killed in the fracas. We saw very gruesome images of, violence meted out against, some other, non-South African citizens, that is. And a lot of other parties came and they were jumping on the bandwagon as well, supporting this action. Whereas other parties, of course, and we'll talk about this in another session, other parties like the EFF came and they were very pronounced against this move by what looked like a very popular, movement. The president of the country, of course, Cyril Ramaphosa, he condemned the actions of the protesters. So did the UN Secretary General and a lot of other progressive figures on the continent, and a lot of other people have termed this differently. So, comrade, to jump straight into it, we are aware of the situation in South Africa, at least economically. The recent political history, being one of the newest born countries, if you want to call it that, at least in its current configuration. 1994 is always the era that we point to as the time when the country gained, its independence from the British earlier, and then transfer from white minority rule, to popular democracy in 1994. Despite that, of course, unemployment remains on high, right? We're still comrades are still mobilizing to see a redistribution of resources, a redress of historical injustices that recently earned the ire of the United States. And you also the episode when their group went to meet the president in the White House. But I want to just cite this survey by the Inclusive Society Institute, the GovDem survey, that states that distrust of African immigrants among South Africans climbed from 62.6% in 2021 to 73.1% in 2025. So you can see that all over the place, there's generally a distrust of those who come in. And comrade, before I bring you in, I want to just share a bit of my experience, right? When I was in the country, I was educated in the country for 2 years, and then I went back afterwards independently for research, or to fellowship, whatever you want to call it. And I remember just the sentiment around I was, interestingly enough, most of the Ubers that I took were being driven by Zimbabweans. So you can say 3 out of 5 Ubers that I took were being driven by Zimbabweans. But I remember one particular gentleman driving, me around Cape Town, and he was telling me, if I dropped you, he was pointing to a township, and he was like, if I dropped you in that township, you won't come out alive. And I'm like, on what basis? And I don't know. Back then I was telling him, I don't know any other African country in which that is a reality, in which people can smell the foreigner in you. But if you dropped somebody in a slum, for example, in Kampala, I don't think beyond the usual theft and petty crime, I think, which everyone faces the risk of, I don't think there is a death card, hanging on you, just because you are not from the country. So that was the, backdrop. So, Comrade, I just want to bring you in on this issue. What do we make of this? Obviously, this is not the first time that this has happened in Southern Africa, in South Africa to be particular. In 2015, you saw that wave as well of xenophobia that resulted in lots of deaths and, again, lots of violence and crime. So what do we make of this recent episode?
Thank you very much, Olemo. And once again, I just want to say how happy I am to be on the platform and have these important conversations that are contributing to a broader, more pure aspiration of conscientizing, like we like to say here on the Fourth Generation platform, the future African intellectual and the future African public citizen. So, on to today's subject, South Africa, xenophobia. It is certainly something that burdens the heart, for contemporary Black African society, to see this fratricidal conflict, this internecine warfare, Black on Black crime, Black on Black violence. These are terms and phraseologies that kind of imply or insinuate or bring to mind a failure of unity, a failure of solidarity, a failure of understanding the common victimization, the shared suffering, both historical and contemporary, of people of African descent. And South Africa, I think, typifies the failure of Pan-Africanism in its starkest and ugliest manifestation. But while it is easy to lament and to just feel completely disparaged or completely demoralized by the way the situation is playing out, I think for us as intellectuals, the duty is to take away the dramatics and the sensationalism and try to go to the root of the problem. What is happening here? Is it just a case of the big weakness of Africans, which is supposedly the inability for them to solve conflicts like civilized human beings, and always resorting to this form of tribal violence, that is characterized by is it called the Dudu's way? Dudu way? You
Uh,
can clarify.
um, is it the group Dudula? Is it
Yeah,
Operation
Dudula.
Dudula?
That's the
The
term I'm
first year.
looking for. Yeah, the term I'm looking for. And this kind of very typical, very characteristic African costuming, in which you see animal skins and spears and shields, that are reminiscent of African tribal kind of presentation and paraphernalia. And I think symbolism is just as important as the issue of xenophobia that's at the heart of this debate. The fact that South Africans have chosen to appropriate or to front, to foreground this African dressing as the appropriate battle costume within which to address this issue. It even adds a further layer to the contradiction of how Africa is a place that still has to come to terms with its own diversity, with its own multinationalism, and how Pan-Africanism is still not addressing the respective independent interests of the parts that make up the body of the African global community. So for me, starting with a history is important. Trying to look at how the interaction between native South African Bantu or black populations, as the apartheid government called them, and other non-South African, non-native Bantu, how that interaction has played out starting from a time before black majority rule in 1994.
Yeah.
And I think one kind of phenomenon that stands out for me is how most of the countries surrounding South Africa, I think Mozambique, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and perhaps some further afield like Malawi, were viewed by the Afrikaner nationalist government as labor reserves for the thriving mining economy in South Africa at the time. Now, it was important to create this antagonism between native black South Africans and Africans from outside South Africa, to create a certain, first of all, a legal distinction in their identities, and also a kind of a difference in the economic and social rights that each of these groups had, despite the fact that they looked the same. So, of course, it was in the interest of the minority Afrikaner government not to invest or not to give economic opportunities to its own natives, to keep them poor, to keep them completely disenfranchised from this otherwise first world economy that existed in their midst. So how do you do that? You ensure that you don't transfer skills to them. You ensure that you don't employ them in the factories. You ensure that you don't employ them in the mines. Keep them only at the very menial level, of doing domestic house chores and, unskilled labor in the mines. But if you need any professionals, any level of middle management, import them from as far as Europe, the mother continent. But because those are maybe expensive, then the middle tier of skilled artisans and it is import them now from these neighboring countries, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique. And so that was a formal official policy within the period of apartheid. So that then they set up this dynamic in which these two groups were now in competition with each other. Um, the black South Africans saw these foreigners as actually working deliberately against their interests, because they accepted to come and work in the farms and in the mines and etc. And indirectly, therefore, make it possible for the Afrikaner government to completely ignore and continue under developing its own black population. So I think that is, for me, a very important historical dimension to introduce to this debate.
Yeah.
And understand that after black majority rule, then the black government and the black elite in South Africa that took over, therefore faced a dilemma. Here you have a domestic situation in which you have a population of non-native blacks that have been favored, that is still present in the country, but then you also have this moral image of the rest of Africa having, united around the frontline states and etc. to support the Black freedom struggle in
Yes.
South Africa.
South Africa, yeah.
So then, how do you navigate, that contradiction? And so it becomes a very big problem. Now, add to that the very, very big problem of the Black South African government being hamstrung by this need to kind of live up to the transition agreement that was made.
Yeah.
The fact that this freedom has been negotiated and negotiated on the basis of building a non-racial kind of non-confrontational post-apartheid society in which we are not going to punish whoever was responsible. Legally, the best we can do is have truth and reconciliation commissions that seek to build understanding and forgiveness. And then when it comes now to the touchy issue of the commanding heights of the economy, there is no seizure of lands. There's going to be no redistribution, of the economic cake. And so it becomes a very, very big dilemma for whoever is in charge of South Africa, the ANC, so to speak, to address, at least from the get-go, the very fundamentals of economic inequality that exist.
Yeah.
And so here you have an untouchable former apartheid class that is still in charge of the economy. And then the little crumbs of the economy that are now available for the ANC government to kind of redistribute are certainly being competed for both by native blacks and a very significant minority of non-native blacks that are probably better trained, because the rest of Africa had a head start in its independence. So it was able to train artisans, it was able to train professionals, doctors from Nigeria, teachers from Uganda, engineers from Liberia, wherever. Now they are able to now come into democratic South Africa and take advantage of huge, huge job vacancies that Black South Africans had never been prepared for because they were completely excluded from education and skills development all throughout that period. So, yeah, for me, that would be my opening shot for now.
So, Comrade, you've given us a very good historical backdrop, and I think what we're going to do is that we'll untangle some of those issues bit by bit, right? But I want to take you back to the first point that you made on the characterization of this as, because there's the economic dimension which you introduced, which is very important. The fact that Southern Africa has actually always been a regional economy. And this is the problem with capitalism, that we want to allow capital to move. You're useful to us only to the extent to which you can continue contributing to the overall project of economic accumulation. But I want to take you back to the initial statement that you made on and the characterization of this as fratricidal violence, right? Now, that's a very that has certain assumptions to it, right? And I'll take us back to that article that we've circulated for this discussion on and which we'll share with the comrades engaging as well, by Dr. Achille Mbembe, which he wrote in 2015 in the aftermath of that episode of xenophobia. And he was saying something. He said that no African should be a foreigner in Africa. That no African is a foreigner in Africa. So that idea that if Black South Africans are acting violently against Black South Africans, then they are somehow, discriminating their own kith and kin, right? That's not a shared understanding. That is not something that is shared in the popular and political imagination in South Africa. Because for us to say it's fratricidal violence, it assumes that we belong to the same family in the first place. But that in the bigger South African imagination, and I think this is where the efforts of more progressive, formations that are trying to impress this idea of unity and Pan-Africanism and thinking about a larger, Africa. Bringing that imagination back is very important, right? But they like looking at these things. This thing is not shared. Right? People don't imagine themselves as Africans, right? And you'd imagine that it's in South Africa, of all places, where that appreciation should be most urgent and most pronounced. But that is not the case, right? So for many of them, and I think maybe this is a problem of nationalism, which we shall address in a second. But yeah, what do you make of that characterization?
100%. I hear the passion and the fervor with which you kind of channel the popular imagination into that statement of saying this should not be the case in South Africa of all places. That's a very important kind of clause to the statement.
Yeah.
What is unique about South Africa that gives them a special burden juxtaposed against the rest of Black Africa? What, for example, allows Nigeria in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s to conduct this Ghana must go campaign, expelling almost, I think, up to 1 million Ghanaians, that had sought economic opportunities in that economy. And Ghana currently, in the past few decades, has also been conducting its own Nigeria Must Go campaign, kicking out, hundreds of thousands of Nigerians. If
Yeah.
anything, many countries across Black Africa have been conducting Nigeria Must Go campaigns.
True.
List of which is not Kenya or even our own native Uganda, kicking out Nigerians because of the perceived, could be accurate, could be partly inaccurate conclusion that they are not as law abiding as they should be. They are mostly engaged in all these kinds of illicit, antisocial, and socially destructive economic activities, from drug smuggling to, organ kind of smuggling, and all kinds of rackets that are actually eating at the body politique and the body social of otherwise more sober, calmer societies. And there's been, pushes against the expulsion of Kenyan expatriates, for example, from the Ugandan corporate private sector. There was a very huge push a couple of decades ago against Kenyan CEOs that seem to dominate so many of the big multinationals in Uganda, from MTN to NTV, etc. Rwandans have been huge victims of eviction and expulsion efforts in Uganda, countless waves of them. The problem in the Eastern DRC is exactly premised on the expulsion of what is perceived as non-native Congolese from Eastern DRC, the Banyamulenge, who are perceived as ethnic Tutsis and ethnic Rwandans. So these kinds of expulsions and xenophobic
It's not
feelings are
unique.
not unique to South
Essentially, it's
Africa.
not unique to South Africa, and so South Africa does not have a unique burden to carry, right? So, comrade, I obviously I agree with that analysis, and the article that we have from Mr. Thomas Lesafra as well, which we distributed, points out to some of those episodes in Senegal, in Nigeria, even in Ghana, right, itself, that expelled Nigerians after the fall of Kwame Nkrumah. And just look at the irony of that, right? Kwame Nkrumah goes out of the picture and the next president comes to expel Nigerians, blaming them for the economic failures of that country. And I think this is the bankruptcy of that argument, essentially, at its barest minimum. When we attribute economic failures to people that we think are aliens in the country, that somehow our country is not progressing because there's this group of people that are coming from elsewhere and there are some kind of leeches on the economy, in spite and despite of their contributions, actually. And I think that what you're pointing to might be a structural issue. That if we have seen so many of this, and this is at the heart of what we're saying, that if we've seen so many of these instances elsewhere, then there might be a line that connects all of them, right? And this is where then Dr. Lushaba says it might be the problem of nationalism. That there's an internal logic within that drives nationalism to the point whereby fratricidal violence becomes inevitable in any case, right? That because we've failed within this framework, within this nationalist framework, which of course is ridden with all the contradictions that we inherited from colonialism, that already puts us against each other. Like you're thinking Rwanda, you're thinking even our own Uganda, with tribalism still very rife, people still talking in terms of our group has eaten, let the other group come in, The first targets are always the non-native blacks, right? But eventually, and this is the point that that the professor, Dr. Mbembe, makes, is that inevitably you will come back to your own family members, right? And I heard Malema making the same argument to people in Marikana, but he obviously didn't speak in the terms of speaking in, but it was essentially a very distilled version of the same argument. And he was telling them, see, the next people that you're going to come from will be people like me from Limpopo. If we are going with Zulu imagery and we are holding a shield and then framing this whole struggle against immigrants in a cultural lens, right? That after you're done with these Zimbabweans and you're done with these folks from around, the next people you're going to come from is us. And that's just the logic of nationalism. But it misplaces the burden and it misplaces the source of the challenges that are being confronted in the first place. And I think that at the bottom of it, it's a problem of political opportunism, right? I was looking at the website for the March and March movement that organized this recent wave of protest. Obviously, there's just the vigilante nonsense that this guy of Operation Dudula conducted when he was picking up people. And this is a very simple argument to make, right? That if we took out all in any of these cases, Uganda, Ghana, you take out the Nigerians from Ghana, where has the country gone? How many jobs have you created by just taking out these people, right? So it's a very, it's an argument that I don't think takes a lot to debunk in terms of its bankruptcy. But going back to March and March, I was looking at their website and you see a very well formulated machine that is masquerading as a civil society organization and using the tactics of civil society mobilization to be able to engender and continue to stir up this, you can call it ethnic hate and all of that, Because you see a machine, you see them mobilizing money online, mobilizing donations, they have merch that they are selling, So I think there's a very, this is not even talking about the other people that stand to benefit from black people fighting against each other, right, in that country. But I think there's a degree of political opportunism involved. Politicians going on the popular sentiment and failing to do the one job they're supposed to do, which is lead effectively, and then preying on the popular sentiment, going with the masses on the issue, and then before you know it, they cannot control what comes out of it.
I hear you, comrades. But I would like to be somewhat controversial and say that I understand the crowds in South Africa that are marching on the streets and saying, these Nigerians are running drug rings. They are turning our country into a narco economy, especially the township economy. They are buying off the elected officials because they are so rich, and many of them have access to, oil wealth in Nigeria that they have looted and acquired illegitimately, and are now laundering through these criminal networks in South Africa. That even taking it to a higher level, the whole issue of state capture that I think was premised on the scandal of the Guptas during Jacob Zuma's time in office, just typifies how possible it is for a well-organized clique of foreign actors to actually have such a negative and damaging impact on a local economy. So, for my part, I understand the moral argument being made here. I understand the pedestrian man on the street kind of thinking that goes into this, and I do not in any condescending way dismiss it, because these actions and these phenomena and these kind of groups have direct impacts on people's lives. And let me say this perhaps before you jump in, that it is possible for multiple truths to coexist. What do I mean? It is possible that the big problems in South Africa, the big problems in Ghana, the big problems in Uganda cannot be immediately solved by expelling this troublesome non-native black minority. But a few problems will be solved by that. And then once that issue is out of the way, then perhaps that actually clears the scene for us to then bring into sharper relief what the big problem is and then address it as well. Just the fact that I am suffering, from an arm amputation doesn't mean I should allow malaria, to take me
Give
down.
up.
These two problems can
Yeah.
threaten my life
Yeah.
simultaneously, and I can choose to deal with the malaria first and then, deal with the arm amputation after. So I feel that it is also intellectually dishonest to accuse native black populations of being hypocritical and not, being kind of in sight of the bigger goal when they choose to go for the low-hanging fruit, because these are low-hanging fruit.
No, I like the characterization as as lower hanging fruit. No, comrade. It's very easy to understand. I think it's easy to understand the origin of such a parochial attitude, right? And I don't want to place it as a burden on anyone and an expectation that somehow you should wake up one morning and just think that you're brethren with your neighbor, because obviously the environment in which you grow up, including even internally within South Africa, there are still ethnic tensions that have not yet bobbed to the surface, right? That still exist. There are still those splits, just like in Uganda, you've often mentioned the north-south split, right? So they still exist, right? They just haven't, we'll put in place certain material conditions that allow it to be contested in one way or another. We speak about it now in our bedrooms. We don't just come out publicly in politics to talk about it, right? So it's easy to understand why I grew up in a patch and somehow I think that there are Cholis whom I speak the same language with essentially are the biggest problem to ever existed. Maybe because some Cholis are now established, they are now the biggest commercial class in a patch. Now I feel like these are Cholis, they must go, because once they go, now the same thing Amin did with the Indians and the likes, right? Or even think about our country today, Uganda. The fact that a very big, and the world generally, right? It's a phenomenon that in a lot of these establishments that you'll find a lot of finance being run by people of Indian descent, right? Does that mean that they are the cause for the problems that we face as a society? Obviously, no. And the other issue is also very important. If we say that the problem is criminality, right? And this is where leadership and guidance is important. If the challenge is criminality, there are laws. There are legal systems that are supposed to deal with these laws. If the problem is that there is, and even if we concede and say this Pan-African project is not very useful, right? Or that our Pan-Africanism should not be guided by sentiment that, okay, Ugandan should not be in South Africa just because I'm a Ugandan, right? There is the legal end of things, that if you find a criminal in your country, what do? There are laws that are supposed to deal with that. Obviously, mob justice is not legal. That's criminality, right? As we've seen in this recent episode and other episodes, that's criminality. Even if we're not to go for the sociological, humanistic arguments about how we should enjoy space and time on the African continent as black people who have as an inheritance all this land that we have. Even if we don't even hearken to the arguments of, say, the fact that during Shaka's time, he pushed out some people who ended up going to different parts of the continent that are not, including East Africa, that are now not the territory that we know of as Southern Africa. I mean, if we don't hearken to complex historical arguments, simple, actually, historical arguments like that, the problem of criminality is very simple. You meet a criminal in a country, in any jurisdiction, whether you're Ugandan, whether you're South African, whether you're who, there are laws in place that are supposed to deal with that criminality. But where I brought the argument of political opportunism is to say that if you are an organization that's very well aware of the laws and you're very well aware of the attitudes of the masses, right? And you know what stirring up and sparking that attitude, that time bomb is going to do, and you still go ahead and light the match, then you earn the level of an opportunity. So it's not necessarily even the marchers themselves. Much as I think there should be an appreciation of those circles, but the leaders of these movements who know what the attitudes are at the grassroots, and yet they still go ahead to mobilize on those same lines because they have sponsors and because they have people that are willing to back them up. I think that earns the label of political opportunism, and it's very dangerous for the future of the continent because they also know that eventually they'll mobilize it at the vote. And that's why you find parties like IFP, MK, Action SA, you see them aligning themselves with such formations. I have no sympathies at all for it because the leaders should know better.
Indeed. But I still think that is a very idealistic, puritanical conclusion to make about South Africa's leaders. Politicians will be politicians, even in South Africa. Even the successors of the untouchable Nelson Mandela, who has come to epitomize the very perfection of post-colonial African leadership, are human. And indeed, perhaps that bar is too high, that the fact that they are always being judged against the bar of Nelson Mandela, while we allow leaders in the rest of Black Africa to get away with more heinous crimes simply because they are being judged against much lower bars. Uganda's leaders, for example, are always judged against the bar of Idi Amin, and it's very difficult to go below that.
Yeah, yeah.
So no matter what they do, they'll always be thought of as good leaders by both their populations and the rest of the world. While South
Yeah.
Africa's leaders, however high they perform, they may never reach the zenith that Mandela managed to register. So I think it's also a perception problem, and it's
Yeah.
also a reputational question here. But I would like to harken back to a metaphor that was first mentioned either by Wole Soyinka or Julius Nyerere. I don't remember exactly which, but he talked about how once you choose to ride a tiger, you should know that you can never get down.
Uh,
You
you
can
have
never
to.
get down from it. It's a one-way street.
uh, uh,
It's a one-way street.
mm,
You have to ride it until it
uh,
collapses out of exhaustion and dies.
uh,
But you can't just choose to end the ride midway and say, "Oh, I'm tired." No,
mm, mm, mm,
because then it will devour you. You will become the meal. So
yeah.
these politicians in South Africa that are now, voicing support for the crowds on the streets
Mm,
understand that there is a tiger on the loose.
mm. And
There's a
uh,
and not many people in this world, and perhaps not just South Africa alone, not many politicians in this
mm.
world are as daring and brave as Julius
That's
Malema.
Julius.
He's in a
Mm.
class of his own, and he should be respected for that.
Julius went and told these people that if this is how you're going to act, I don't need your votes.
So if anything, he has earned the respect of Africa and the world in this time, because this is when it actually counts, you know, to show what your principles as a leader are. And so I just want to say that I understand the politicians' actions, because I would be surprised if they acted otherwise.
Exactly. Otherwise, yeah.
I would be very surprised if they acted otherwise. And the only winner politically that emerges from this is really Julius Malema in the long run. And can you hear me still?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, exactly. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
And just to conclude on that point, I would like to say that I think there is a problem that we are not being honest in acknowledging here, and that is the legitimation that comes with longevity of stay. Once our designated foreign minority occupies space in a country for a long time, and these countries in Africa are not very stable, both in terms of political structure. Governments get overthrown and recycled every few years, and also the legal framework is always being updated and revised and etc. And so questions of demography, questions of nativity, questions of residence are always being debated and being redefined, and the truth is easily lost in history because our states and our countries lack that institutional memory that more established uh, states and territories in Europe and the Americas and the developed parts of Asia have. So a domestic minority can easily become a problem if it is allowed to sink roots and stay long enough. The question of the Asian minority in East Africa is a case in point. The Lebanese minority in West Africa is a case in point. The white minorities in Southern Africa are a case in point. They can choose to be a force for good, in terms of accepting that this is their adopted home and they need to contribute to the benefit of the society as a whole, but they can also choose to be a force for wrong and for destruction, especially when they feel cornered. Then they can easily lend themselves and their skills and their money and their resources to supporting the more reactionary elements within society. And so, perhaps the highlight of this is how the Rwandese refugee minority in Uganda actually overthrew a government, a legitimately elected government. you know?
But they could make the claim that they're African, right? And I think that this is at the heart of the problem. Even when we I think this is going to be the subject of our next discussion. What does a progressive Pan-Africanism actually look like in praxis, right? Let me just give you some anecdotal context. I was in South Africa. You're mentioning a minority group contributing. In 2023, when I was there, I attended a session at the University of Johannesburg where a group of Zimbabweans had gathered, I think with a professor there that the name is running away from me, but I'll get it. Trevor Ngwani, that's the name of the professor. And he had hosted them. I think there's a social institute there, and they were just airing their grievances and put together I wouldn't call it a manifesto, but some of the issues that they were going through in a document. And you look at, these are honest folks. Some of them have been in the country 20 years. They have never been allowed a legal path to citizenship. And it's not like they are the drug dealers or they are the kingpins. This is somebody who is on the side of the street there educating children or taking care of domestic duties there. And they have been contributing. These are honest people, right? That have been contributing to the economy honestly and trying to survive while they're at it. you know. So we can't use blanket characterizations, and this is why the law becomes very important, and why that characterization of the problem as being against a foreigner class that is somehow inimical in its nature to development becomes very obscurantist, right? Because there are different people at all levels pursuing different. I met one of the people there. He was a minister of the gospel. The man went to South Africa to preach. So, and the man was making an argument, and he was in tears, and he was saying, I've been here. My wife is even from this place. My children are here, and I came for this assignment. How are you going to tell me that I cannot access citizenship, or at the very least, be fairly treated in this place? And I think so there's merit to that argument that no African should feel like a foreigner on the continent. And the Europeans do this very well, right? But I think that we need to, just to go back and try and connect this to the other third article that we circulated, that I wrote when I was at Notre Dame, and this was during when things got heated in this country with the recent administration. And the ICE, as they call it, was all over the streets, picking up people, taking them back, deporting them, and all of that. Now, sometimes the way things are framed is very important. And the way particularly, I maintain that political opportunists frame issues is very important, right? So the claim that one makes that the problems of this country, which predate even the migrants themselves, are somehow down to this group that then is labeled as being very unproductive, as being a group that is just, accumulating from the state. And then we forget the bigger issues. That, I think, is the biggest challenge with political opportunism, that we take the eyes of the masses away from what is happening. And the problem with that is that eventually, as if you read Cesare's discourses on colonialism, that got Dr. Loshaba a lot of heat when he mentioned to them that essentially, if you placate Hitler, he will come back and turn on you, like what happened in the Weimar Republic, right? You have workers, the depression is going on, there are no economic opportunities, people are suffering, so preying on the legitimate problems of people, right, to propel your own political agenda, it never ends well. I think the historical precedents are clear. It never ends well, because that kind of political logic rests on the necessitating factor is a scapegoat. But the question is, after you run out of the foreigner scapegoat, you still have to face your problem, which remains unsolved. So what do? Right? You now start looking internally, and now we turn the guns on each other. And I think that's where now we go back to where you began from, on the problem of fratricide, right? After we've expelled all the foreigners, now we're going to look for foreigners among each other, because we have distracted ourselves from the larger political and economic problems at play. And I think that that's a very dangerous politics as a precedent to set, not only in South Africa, but anywhere on the continent. Comrade, I think we've... yes.
I agree 100%. I think this is a defining moment for Africa. We have to really gaze deep into our souls and ask ourselves, what the meaning of our identity is in the modern day and age, and what is nationalism, what is citizenship, what does it really mean to be born and to belong to the African political and cultural community. So while it is a sad turn of affairs, I think it is a labor pain. It is like a contraction that signals an underlying problem. It is a symptom that we need to see as pointing us to a necessary conversation to be had. And I think it is PLO Lumumba who, a few days ago wrote an open letter to the president of South Africa, addressing this very issue. And I would recommend our viewers and listeners to seek that letter out. We'll also post it in the material attached to this show, and that he's really calling for a soul searching, and that should not just be about the leaders in government offices. It is also about ourselves as Africans living today and as public intellectuals who think that we have something to say to ourselves and to the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll definitely attach that that letter to this video and to the audio as well. And I think, Comrade, the logical next step, maybe in our next session, is we'll be considering what a practical politics of Pan-Africanism looks like, and how that, but we'll also be weighing it with the politics of the EFF and Comrade Julius, who has come under fire from every section, from within his own country and elsewhere. People have been interrogating the EFF manifesto, and they cannot believe what the EFF has been saying on this position all along. But despite their ascension and despite all the labels that they populist outfits, you can see the position that they have taken as a non-negotiable one on Pan-Africanism, at risk to their own electoral outcomes, in a time that the black vote in South Africa is even more divided than ever. And for that episode, we'll be joined by a comrade that we've had on this platform before, and we'll be speaking at length about, how we conceive of Pan-Africanism in light of those, recent developments. I think it's safe to conclude also with that remark by Dr. Loshaba, that, there is no xenophobic gene anywhere, that there is no inherent gene of xenophobia, either in South Africans or anyone. But these are problems that sometimes can be attributed to structure, right, and material conditions, and that means that it can arise, and it has a reason, as we pointed out during the course of this conversation, anywhere, right? And so our work as leadership, our work as people who are thinking seriously about these countries, and the fourth generation as well, who one day will have the opportunity, and are already having the opportunity to lead our societies, is to think critically, right, in order to establish positions that reflect reality and truth. Till then, let's stay committed, subscribe to the platforms, and let's engage in the comments. Let's engage with all our platforms on these issues, and we'll see you for that next session.
Thank you.